Welcome back to API Can Code's first unit, Data in Learners' Lives. This is our last lesson of the first unit, building a survey for data collection. This lesson has a couple different goals. One is to introduce students to some sampling designs for good representative samples. Another is to have them create a Google form to collect data, potentially on a local area project of interest. And finally, they'll learn about some basic data cleaning issues and solutions to potentially use in the course of collecting data. So you may start off by recapping the previous lesson. Lesson 1.5 talked about the 5 V's. We also looked at the Starbucks dataset, and students looked into their own datasets to evaluate those. Our first content slide is on good data science questions. Some past experience has shown us that students often struggle with sort of what scope and topics to include or what kind of question to write for a data science question, especially for things like the final project. So we tried to start this early. We do recommend showing at the bottom there's a link to list these examples. This is a list of data science questions with accompanying data sets, I think in most cases, from Bootstrap. And we recommend showing these examples to students to get them thinking about what kinds of questions they could be asking. So we do want students here to think about a data science question about the local issue they've been looking at, or revise an existing one that already has been written. So in the last class, students looked at secondary sources for their local area project of interest. This may have been an article on the internet. It may have been a data set on Kaggle or RapidAPI or somewhere else. Today, we're going to think about a primary source for their project. We have some questions in the worksheet. These are: what question would you like to answer? Who would you like to gather data from? What questions should you ask? And what kinds of responses do you want to get back? So this is an early stage of thinking about what a survey form would look like for this primary source. As we start thinking about these surveys, we want students thinking about what kind of data they may get back. Especially given that they're working with Google Forms. Google Forms offers some tools to help manage sort of data messiness, and we'll talk about one key issue here. So the activity here is for students to write down their answer to what grade are you in. What we found running this activity before, and here's what we expect you'll find as well, is that some students write down the number 10, 1-0. Some students write down the word 10, T-E-N. This is assuming a 10th grade class. Some students will write 10th. Some may write sophomore. And you get a whole bunch of different responses, even though all the students are actually giving the same answer. So this is a nice opportunity for a class discussion around what problems these differences in format could cause as people respond to the survey. Now that we've done that activity, let's ask about how to fix that problem. So we want to ask students about two strategies. One that they could use if they'd already collected the data, not ideal, and one strategy to fix this problem if they were still creating the survey. One recommendation here is to show students the Google Forms tool that allows for basic data validation. So for example, students might set a condition on a response that says this has to be a number. For example, if they're collecting grade level, they might say the response has to be a number, and that way the respondent can't say something like 10th or 10 in letters. The following few slides go over a couple different sampling designs that students might see at several points in their educational career, or they might use when they're thinking about collecting data for their local issue project. So the first one we have is the simple random sample. This is probably the easiest kind of random sample to understand. We have a population, in this case 12 people in that population, and we're picking 3 of them with no divisions or sort of weighting throughout the population other than we're going to pick 3. Our next sampling design is systematic. This has less of an element of randomness, although theoretically it still does randomly select. So in this design, you simply pick every third person, or in a different design, some other interval, but you're selecting systematically. So you're not selecting randomly, you're just going through systematically and picking sort of every interval there. The next one up is stratified. In this case, we take a population, and before we do our random sampling, we break them into strata. In this case, you can see we've sort of divided the population into shades of blue. You can imagine doing this with gender or race or some other aspect to make sure that you have a representative sample on the way out, and that representation is sort of the same percentages as those groups in the actual population. The last kind of sampling design that we're going to discuss is the cluster sample. So what goes on here is, rather than sort of treating the population as a whole, you assume that each of the clusters, these could be schools, these could be classrooms, these could be some other group, but you assume that each of those clusters is somewhat representative of the population at large. And what you do, instead of randomly selecting individuals, is you randomly select clusters. So in this case, we wind up with 2 clusters that make up our sample group. And we hope, fingers crossed, that those clusters do wind up being pretty representative of the overall population. We also want to talk about some bad sampling designs. So the first one is convenience samples. This is like asking your friends to fill out a survey or giving the survey to the first 100 people to show up to a school sports game. Obviously, if the question is sports focused, then that feels like it's going to be kind of a biased sample. You're getting these people that are really excited about showing up. Another problematic sample design is the voluntary response sample, where participants can choose if they want to participate. You might have a poster up in the main hallway, and maybe there's a QR code on it, and students can decide if they want to respond or not. Some issues of representation and bias that students might come up with here is that generally, if people have the option to participate, they're only going to participate if they have a really strong opinion. And the convenience sample obviously just winds up being a really limited part of the population. There's no random selection, and there's no guarantee that that's going to be a representative group. Samples obviously matter. We want to make sure there is good representation for the samples that we're drawing. When our samples do a good job of representing the population, we often get an accurate and meaningful picture of what's true. When there's bias, often coming from a bad design, the sample might misrepresent what's really going on in the population. So this is a sneak peek of an activity in Unit 2. And we're going to use it to have students think about bad sampling design and unrepresentative samples. So next unit, we're going to talk about food deserts, or areas in cities with limited access to plentiful, nutritious, and affordable food. On their worksheets, we want students answering the question, what might bad sampling design look like if you were studying food deserts? Students might think about a question that could be problematic. It could be worded poorly. It could be slanted in a certain way. It might not clearly explain how participants are supposed to respond. And also the people for the sample could be chosen poorly. So again, going back to those bad sampling designs, an example of a bad sample could be a convenience sample where I ask all my friends about the nearest grocery store, and likely that's going to be a group that all looks pretty homogeneous in one way or another. Another example of a bad sampling design is racial profiling. Sometimes students struggle to make this connection a little bit. If you want to give them some help, have them think about sort of whether racial profiling is representative of the entire population, and if it's not, have them think about who it overrepresents or underrepresents when we're thinking about criminal investigations. So finally, at this point, students are actually going to go in and build their Google form. You should have them think about those data validation questions from earlier. How are they going to make sure that data is coming in a parsable, intelligible way? And to think a little bit about the sampling design for their data collection, leaning towards a good sampling design, hopefully, that's going to represent their population and not misrepresent it. Our exit ticket has a couple different types of sampling designs shown here. I won't review all of these, but there is a key in that exit ticket that you can check to grade students' work. As always, thanks for watching this prep video, and thank you for teaching this curriculum.